Good morning, my dear brothers and sisters in Christ Jesus. We've had a real good study weekend on Paul's letter to Titus, and I hope that our time together has been an encouragement to each of us, and that it continues throughout this day and beyond. I got to warn you, my talk is going to be a lot like Glendon's. At least I'm going to start with the same verse. We are now gathered together at the central point of our meeting together. We are gathered together around the table of our absent Lord. Paul describes it as according to the faith of God's elect. This is not just any faith, as Glendon pointed out. Not simply the faith that we were raised with, or some shot-in-the-dark hope. We are gathered here according to the faith of God's elect. Do we appreciate that, brothers and sisters? It's so easy to come together here each Sunday morning and not appreciate, to take for granted the opportunity that we have. The faith of God's elect. Do you think of yourself as God's elect? Brothers and sisters, it seems that there are two common pitfalls of the flesh when we realize that we have been elected by God. Either we want to run and hide and shrink away from that calling and that responsibility, or we go to the other extreme and become prideful. Moses comes to mind. Remember when he was called to go back to Egypt? He said, "Who am I that I should go?" He didn't think he could do what God had called him to do. And of course, as we've mentioned many times, the scribes and the Pharisees were the example of the prideful. They thought there was something special about them. Of course, the truth is a balance between these two extremes. Now, brothers and sisters, if we consider both of these responses, we will realize that both come from within. Both come from the flesh thinking about itself, from focusing internally. God tells us that we can do all things through Him who strengthens us. The election of Yahweh is about Yahweh. It is not about us. So, brothers and sisters, as we are gathered here this morning before this table of our absent Lord, there's no need for feeling inadequate, even though that is very natural. Yahweh knows us inside and out. He has called us for His purpose. He can make the weak strong. But there's also no place for feeling prideful, although that is also a natural tendency. We have been called to God's purpose. We have been called despite what we are, not because of what we are. So, let's turn to Paul's letter to Titus. To begin, I would just like to outline a few points that I would like to consider this morning for our exhortation. Now, we've had quite a lot of discussion already this weekend on Paul's letter to Titus. So I've chosen to step back a little bit and look at the bigger, more general picture this morning. I'll start with a little bit of an outline. Just 4 points I would like to talk about this morning. And number one, that Paul's letter to Timothy and to Titus are considered pastoral letters. We'll take a look at what that means and the implication that there is for us. Number two, we cannot give what we do not have. It's a very simple truth that Paul is implying in his letter. What does that mean? And number three, always consider or remember where you have been. This is Paul's instruction, and it is a very important mindset that we should do well to consider. And number four, the fourth point that I would like to look at is the idea of maintaining. We hope to have a look at what that entails. Okay, so that's 4 points that I would like to consider. Let's take a look at number one. Paul's letter to Timothy, as well as Paul's letter to Titus, have been described as pastoral letters. The dictionary defines a pastoral letter as descriptive of the life of shepherds, or relating to the care of souls. We can see how both of these definitions have common ground. Now let me be real clear, so there's no misunderstanding, because some seem to struggle with the idea of having shepherds in the ecclesia. So let me say this. We are called to the truth as sheep. We live in the truth as sheep, and we die in the truth as sheep. Christ was a lamb led to the slaughter, or the Lamb of God. There is nobody who one day changes over and becomes a shepherd and puts off being the sheep. You might say, well, what does that mean? It simply means that we at all times need to follow the true shepherd. It also means that we at all times or at any time may require assistance or help from our brothers and sisters in the truth. We have many examples, which was spoken of yesterday, of believers going astray at all ages. Even Paul himself says in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he says, "But I keep under my body, and I bring it into subjection, lest that by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway." Okay, so I hope that's clear. Now back to the pastoral letters. A quick read of these two letters, both to Timothy and Titus, is sure to verify that they are Paul's instruction on how to be an effective shepherd in the ecclesia and how to care for one another. So we need to reconcile these two ideas. Whether it be instruction for elder sisters or the qualification of a bishop, these letters are matters of guidance in the care of the ecclesia. Paul's instruction, especially here in chapter 3 of his letter to Titus, is described as instruction to seek a living ecclesia. So again, in the big picture, we have instruction to take up the role as a guide or a leader or a shepherd, however you would like to view the role. This is not a change that takes place and one day, poof, in the pasture, a sheep turns into a shepherd. And it's not that some are born shepherds. It's a role or a calling. Jesus taught a parable of the Good Samaritan. He was stopping and helping a stranger in the ditch. This was Christ's example of a man fit for the kingdom of God. Brothers and sisters, what did he have that the other two did not? Why did he choose to help? Why did the priest and the Levite distance themselves from the man in need? I have pondered the idea, and maybe it's because one represents the law, and he was unable to save, just like the law. Or maybe they represented the man who knew the truth, but it had no effect in changing or transforming who he was. Whatever the case, the Samaritan stopped what he was doing and did everything that he could to save the man, not only that day, but in the future. Titus 3, as we have mentioned, is concerning instruction to be a living ecclesia. Christ's words about the ecclesia in Sardis are these: "And unto the angel of the church in Sardis write, These things saith he that hath the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars. I know thy works, that thou hast a name that thou livest, and art dead. Be watchful, and strengthen the things which remain, that are ready to die. For I have not found thy works perfect before God." What do we note here? Well, one, they had a name of being alive. Well, who thought of them as alive? Well, we can guess that it was either those close to them, or what I feel is more likely, that it was what they thought of themselves. They thought they were doing a pretty good job. We might think about the priest and the Levite in the Good Samaritan story. Number 2, how do we know they were spiritually dead? What was it based on? Well, we're told, I know thy works. They were being judged by what they were doing. And number 3, so what is the instruction on how to fix this problem? Wake up, watch, help those who have not yet died. This seems like a pretty serious problem. So let's go back to Titus and Paul's instruction. This brings us to point number 2. We cannot give what we do not have. This is a paraphrase. You won't find this statement in Titus. Paul has been instructing both Timothy and Titus about the care of the body, or the ecclesia. So point 2 is very simple. An example of that might be that of an elder sister. An elder sister cannot teach a younger sister to love her husband if the elder sister doesn't know how to love her husband. That's a very simple observation, but isn't it true? A brother cannot lead an ecclesia unless he knows how to lead an ecclesia. You cannot give an answer if you don't have the answer. You could go on, but the point Paul is trying to teach is really the same point as that found in Matthew chapter 6. The point is again very simple. There is only one source of true light, but we must allow it to enter and influence us. The subtitle for this section in Matthew is Lay Up Treasure in Heaven. We'll come in at verse 21. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. The light of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. But if thine eye be evil, thy whole body shall be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in thee be darkness, how great is that darkness? Okay, so let's go back to verse 22. The light of the body is the eye. Now remember, we're talking about leading or shepherding an ecclesia. And the point that we're trying to make is that you cannot give what you do not have. So we understand light to be knowledge, right? The knowledge of God. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. Now the word single really means folded together. I believe it's saying that if your eyes are focused, if they are folded together and pointing at the same thing. Have you ever talked to a person who had eyes pointing in different directions? It's hard to know where they're looking, isn't it? It almost seems like the person isn't paying attention to what you're saying. Well, I believe that that's what we're being told. So the verse continues. If the eyes are single or focused, the whole body will be full of light. But verse 23, if thine eye be evil. Now the word for evil means no effect or influence. Thy whole body shall be full of darkness. This is like a house with one window, but the shade is pulled. The light has no influence. So what are we really talking about here? We're talking about being a shepherd, right? In the ecclesia. And not being able to give what you don't have. So look at Christ's words. He is speaking about the Pharisees. Matthew 15 verse 14 says, Let them alone. They be blind leaders of the blind. And if the blind lead the blind, both shall fall into the ditch. Brothers and sisters, here we have the Pharisees who are trying to shepherd the sheep. But Christ says they were blind. They weren't literally blind, but they had an evil eye. The light had had no influence in their life. So the only leading they could do was leading everyone into the ditch. Brothers and sisters, do you see what the scriptures are really talking about? It's grace, isn't it? What is grace? Well, Dan talked quite a bit about it yesterday. Grace is God's influence on our heart and its reflection in our life. So we can only tell if we are influenced when it reflects as good works in our life. Jesus said the Pharisees were blind. Well, that's a pretty good description of someone whose eye was not allowing light to influence or guide their body. This is a definition of a blind person. The verse continues, If therefore the light that is in thee be darkness, how great is that darkness? Now here we have something even worse. Most people who are blind, they know it, right? I'm guessing. But this type of individual is spiritually blind. So he is absolutely dangerous because he thinks he can see. Our world is full of this type. Like the window with the shade pulled, there is something blocking the light from entering the body and having an influence. So the only light that they have to influence their feelings or their intellect will be the light from within. which as far as eternity goes, it's absolute blindness. Okay, so what's my point? Well, if we're going to follow Paul's instruction and be an asset to a living ecclesia, we can only do that if we are fully focused on the truth and nothing else is in the way, blocking that light. So how important is this? What if we just want to be sheep? What if we want to take care of our own business and let others do the same? And we have no desire to be a shepherd. Well, let's look again at 1 Corinthians, the same chapter, chapter 11. It says, we are all familiar with this chapter because we hear it most Sundays. We'll start at verse 27. Wherefore, whosoever shall eat this bread and drink this cup of the Lord unworthily shall be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. But let a man examine himself, and so let him eat that bread and drink of that cup. For he that eateth and drinketh unworthily eateth and drinketh damnation to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. Okay, so what is this saying? Well, one, it's saying that we need to examine ourselves, right? That's what Gordon said in his prayer. So that we are not eating and drinking unworthily. Because if we do, we are guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. Okay, so this is pretty important stuff. But what are we examining ourselves for? I mean, we really need to have an answer for this, or we could be in a serious situation. Let's look at verse 29. This seems to be describing a person who is eating and drinking unworthily, and it seems to be telling us why. It says they are not discerning the Lord's body. Well, what does that mean? Well, verse 30 continues. For this cause. Wait, what cause are we talking about? Well, it has to be referring to the verse previous, right before. The not discerning the Lord's body part. So because we are not discerning the Lord's body, there are, and the verse continues, many weak and sickly among you, and many sleep. So whatever not discerning the Lord's body means, it's causing many to be weak and sickly, and many to sleep. This is starting to sound like a shepherding problem, isn't it? But look at the next verse. Let's make sense of that. For if we would judge ourselves, we should not be judged. Now, what is this? Is this a whole different thought? Or is this the answer? Well, since we haven't seen the answer, I'm guessing it must be an answer. But I still don't know what I'm judging myself for. What did I do wrong here? Let's keep reading. But when we are judged, okay, hold on. Now we're getting judged. That must mean that we didn't do verse 31. We didn't judge ourselves. So now the Lord is doing it. Okay, but I still don't know what I did wrong. Whatever it was, it had a damaging effect, or at least not a helping effect on my brothers and sisters. Because some are sick, and some are weak, and some are sleeping. So we need to figure this out, for this chastening of the Lord, so that we would not be condemned with the world, isn't going to help much. Verse 33. Wherefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat, tarry one for another. Now notice the phrase, when you come together, tarry, in verse 33. In chapter 16, verse 11, we see the same word is used, and it's the phrase, I look for him, or I watch out for him. Now this is taking us back to earlier in the chapter, where Paul was admonishing them for coming together to break bread, but they were despising the ecclesia. They were not waiting for one another. One was hungry, one was drunken. It is exactly the opposite of crucifying the flesh and sacrificing their lives for their brethren. Let me say here, brothers and sisters, that although Paul is referring to a literal situation that he is using for an example for us, partaking of the sacrifice of Christ is not something that only happens Sunday morning. It starts when we're baptized. It is our life. Let me tell you a short story that may help in understanding this chapter. Most everyone should be able to relate because we've all been young and we've all belonged to a family. And as part of a family, we most likely have chores assigned to us. Am I right? Well, what if you got home from school and you were only thinking about yourself? Only thinking about what you wanted? For me, it was a big peanut butter and jam sandwich. Well, here I am, I'm thinking about myself and I'm forgetting or neglecting my duties. For me, it was feeding cows. Well, supper time rolls around and I haven't judged myself to be sure my part in the family duties have been done. Most chores that children do are to teach them responsibility. And it's a way for them to participate and to show that they are thankful for all that has been done for them. So I sit up to the table, and Dad washes up and takes his chair at the head of the table. Now, I haven't done my chores, but I'm sitting at the table. If my mom hadn't done her work, there would be no supper on the table. If Dad hadn't done his work, there would be no money for supper on the table. But here I am, sitting at the table, wanting all the table has to offer to me, without thinking about where I would be if others did the same. So before we eat, Dad looks up and he says, "Did everyone get their chores done? Terry, did you feed the cows?" Of course, what could I say but, I forgot. "Okay," he says, and he pauses. "You better go out now and feed those cows. And then when you're done, I would like you to go to your room and stay there until Mom calls you for breakfast." He then pauses again and says, "That way you will know how those cows feel when you forget to feed them." Brothers and sisters, that was just the story and no cows were harmed. But hopefully that will be something that comes to mind when we gather together around a table. Do we remember the words of Christ to Peter when he said, "Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me?" What was Peter's answer? He said, "You know I love you, Lord." If that's the case, Jesus said, if that's true, then feed my sheep. Be a shepherd. Okay, point 3. Consider where you have been. This, I believe, is the mindset that Paul wants us to have as we approach the duties of a shepherd. We will begin at the last verse of chapter 2. Chapter 2 was an explanation of the doctrine or the rules of conduct that Paul wanted to remind Titus of. The last verse of the chapter, in verse 15, was instruction to Titus about how to get this message out there. What I would like to pick up on is the how. How does Paul want Titus to get this message across? I believe the point is worth taking note of. Now, he starts out rather strongly, and he makes no bones about the fact that this message is important and that it must be delivered. This is so important that however we choose to teach the truth, the end result must be that the message gets out there. He says, "These things speak and exhort and rebuke with all authority. Let no man despise thee. Let no man belittle or despise this message. To do so allows God's name to be despised and belittled." Okay, so it's very important to be sure the message gets out there. But the point I would like to draw your attention to is verse 2. Verse 1 reminds us that to follow the rules, we should subject ourselves to all authority. And then verse 2 begins. And it really begins a description of how this message must be delivered. Then verse 3 is the why. Let's have a look at verse 2. "But when you are teaching or shepherding or instructing, speak evil of no man." There's no need to call them down. It says, "Be not brawlers." You do not have to start a fight to teach the truth, but rather be gentle, showing all meekness unto all men. Brothers and sisters, isn't that good advice? Yet how often in our communication do we see phrases like, "Well, all true brethren of Christ believe it this way"? It sounds like a godly statement, doesn't it? Yet isn't it more likely to incite anger and unrest? You just implied that if they don't agree with you, that they're not a true brother of Christ. Let's move on. Now, when we have Paul's instruction, why we should be gentle and meek. Sorry, I read that wrong. Now we have Paul's instruction why we should be gentle and meek. Verse 3. He says, "For we ourselves also were sometimes foolish, disobedient, deceived, serving divers lusts and pleasures, living in malice and envy, hateful and hating one another." Paul is simply saying what Jesus taught. Treat others as you would like to be treated. Romans 5 verse 8 says, "God commendeth his love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us." Okay, so the fourth point, maintain good works. Titus 3 verse 8 says, "This is a faithful saying, and these things I will that thou affirm constantly, that they which have believed in God..." Thanks, London. Verse 3. "This is a faithful saying, and these things I will that thou affirm constantly, that they which have believed in God might be careful to maintain good works. These things are good and profitable unto men." And also verse 14. "And let ours also learn to maintain good works for necessary uses, that they be not unfruitful." Good, profitable, and fruitful. Brothers and sisters, this is the last point to look at this morning. And again, obviously very important in the big picture instruction. But it's almost redundant to bring it up, because most everyone would understand that if we have something of value and we want to keep it, then we need to maintain it. But the reason I mention this is because the original for this word maintain is interesting, I thought. Not only is it used twice, but to fail to maintain would render us not good and not profitable and not fruitful. So let's look at what it means, because I believe the definition gives us more than what it is to maintain, but actually tells us how to maintain. The word means to stand before or to preside. I have to admit, at first I was quite confused. How is maintain to preside? Well, let's look at the natural. What does a presider do? Well, he leads, doesn't he? He takes control. He will have an overall plan of what needs to be accomplished. He will start the proceedings on time, for which, of course, he must be on time. He calls for the required action. He keeps the meeting on task and prevents disorder. He sets the tone for the meeting, solemn or joyful. Brothers and sisters, that is just a few comparisons from the natural, but I'm sure you can see my point. Can we ask ourselves, how do we take control of our service to Yahweh? Do we have an overall plan with goals and objectives that our works may be manifest? Do we have a start time and a completion time for each task? Do we call ourselves to action at the appropriate time with the proper action? Do we make sure that we stay on task and not allow distractions? Do we set the tone for all our service as joyful? Brothers and sisters, can we ever hope to teach our brothers and sisters this if we don't have it ourselves? And finally, in summary, the purpose of this letter we looked at was pastoral. It describes the life of a shepherd. We're not born shepherds, but we are called to care for others. Paul gives us ample instruction to this end. Number 2, we cannot give what we do not have. There's only one source of light and truth. We must try hard to remain focused on that true light. Allow the light to penetrate and become the strongest influence in our lives. So much so that it reflects in every work as a bright light for others to follow. Try not to shrink away from our calling, and yet remain humble in all our service. Always consider where we have been when attempting to help our brothers and sisters, so that we can do so in the spirit of meekness, showing love, remembering that we were once servants to sin ourselves, and still able to fail again. And finally, maintain. Take charge of our lives. Organize. Set goals for personal study, for visiting, for beginning and ending projects. Make real commitments to put things of God first, instead of trying to tuck them in where we have a dull or a spare moment. Do our best to attend gatherings and studies, visiting the sick and spreading the gospel message. Brothers and sisters, let us examine ourselves. Are we in the truth, and is the truth in us?